This is Professor Meyer. I'm going to be talking to you about the autonomic nervous system. We're not going to cover the entire chapter, so quite a bit of it has been eliminated. So follow the expected learning outcomes to give you some guidance. So the autonomic nervous system is also known as the visceral motor nervous system. And so these are controlling things that are involuntary, your glands, exocrine and endocrine, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Now, one thing that's a little bit different than the somatic nervous system is that they are really not controlling the organs, they're just adjusting them. So one thing that we do find is that when we cut the nerve to an organ, we cut the autonomic nerve to the organ, you get an exaggerated response of those organs, especially with cardiac muscle or smooth muscle. So you've already been exposed a little bit of some organs that are controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So for instance, the erector pili muscle in your integumentary system is controlled by the autonomic nervous system, specifically the sympathetic division, as well as the eccrine and apocrine sweat glands. Just like the somatic nervous system, you do have autonomic reflexes, and one of them is the barrel reflex. So when you have high blood pressure, that's going to be detected by stretch receptors in your arteries that sends messages to your central nervous system, and then that sends out signals on the vagus nerve traveling down to the heart. The heart rate slows down, and then that decreases the blood pressure. So you have a negative feedback loop here. There are two basic divisions. We've already talked about this in chapter 12, but you have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is preparing the body for physical activity, so that many times we call it the fight or flight response. The parasympathetic is more calming. We call it the resting, digesting state. And so for each one, you had to know already what's happening to the heart rate, to the blood pressure, airflow. And so why we're going to kind of deviate and kind of look into these two divisions and answer these questions. So the sympathetic, we call it the fight or flight. In some manuals, they talk about the 4 E's. And your 4 E's is the emergency, excitement, exercise, and embarrassment. And so your heart rate increases, which will increase your blood pressure. It will dilate your bronchial tubes, which will increase the airflow. Blood is going to be distributed more to skeletal muscles in anticipation for this stressful situation. So it's going to take blood away from the digestive system, kidneys, and your skin. The liver is going to hydrolyze glycogen, and that's going to increase your blood glucose. And then the last thing is that the pupils will dilate. With the parasympathetic, the resting and digesting state, sometimes we use an acronym to describe the most typical parasympathetic activities, and that would be salivation, lacrimation, urination, digestion, and defecation. In this case, the heart rate is decreased, and that decreases your blood pressure. The bronchial tubes are normally in a more constricted state, and so you have normal airflow. Blood is more evenly distributed. The liver is going to be storing glycogen, and that's going to decrease your blood glucose levels. And the pupils are normally more in a more constricted state. So when you look at the autonomic nervous system, we have two motor neurons from the central nervous system to the effector. So the first one is called the presynaptic or the preganglionic. And so that's the one that's coming out of the central nervous system. And then it's going to synapse with the postganglionic neuron. So in the somatic nervous system, you have only one motor neuron. You're always going to release acetylcholine, that neurotransmitter. Remember, this is always going to skeletal muscle. In the autonomic, you will have two motor neurons. They're going to synapse in a ganglion. So you see here. And that in that ganglion will always be acetylcholine. At the axon terminals of the postganglionic fiber, it depends on whether you're looking at the sympathetic or the parasympathetic on which neurotransmitter is being released. So let's look at autonomic tone. So this is kind of background activity that we have, that it exerts its effect on certain organs. So we talked about muscle tone already with the somatic nervous system, and that's with skeletal muscle, where you have a partial contraction in the muscle, you have a firmness. Sympathetic tone is where the parasympathetic is constantly exerting a little bit of an effect. So you have smooth muscle tone in your intestines, and your heart rate, it's held down to about 70 or 80 beats per minute. Normally, it would be at 100 beats per minute. Sympathetic tone is where the sympathetic division exerts more of an effect. And so it keeps most of your blood vessels kind of partially constricted, and that helps maintain your blood pressure. So let's compare the somatic and the autonomic again. So with the somatic motor division here, you have only one motor neuron. With the sympathetic, you have two in a row. The first preganglionic fiber is going to be very short. The second one is going to be much longer, and then that extends to the actual organ. With the parasympathetic, the first one is very long and usually will synapse with the second one in the wall of the actual organ. So we look at the neurotransmitter that is with the inside the ganglion. You have acetylcholine. So between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron, your postganglionic neuron is going to release norepinephrine. And so those are your two neurotransmitters for the sympathetic. For the parasympathetic, in the ganglion, you still have acetylcholine, but the postganglionic is also going to release acetylcholine. So that is only releasing acetylcholine in both of those areas. All right, so let's look at the anatomy of your autonomic nervous system. So we have to look at the sympathetic and the parasympathetic separately. So with the sympathetic, this is also called the thoracolumbar division. These preganglionic neurons are coming from the thorax and lumbar region of your spinal cord. So you can see here. So looking at this, the thoracic and lumbar region. So the somas, the cell bodies of the preganglionic, is in the lateral horns of that region of your spinal cord. And so it goes, it's very short, the preganglionic, goes to the sympathetic chain ganglia. So the preganglionic fiber is very short. They are myelinated. They're going to go to the ganglion using the white communicating ramus. The postganglionic fibers, they leave the ganglion by way of the gray communicating ramus, and they're unmyelinated. That's why it's called gray. So that goes all the way to the target organ. So you look at here, here's where the somas of your preganglionic comes in. and it synapses inside a ganglion, and then you have your postganglionic going to the actual organs. What else is part of the sympathetic is going to be the adrenal glands. So when we look at the adrenal gland, it has two layers. The cortex is the outer layer, and that is going to produce some steroid hormones. Part of the sympathetic is the medulla, which is the inner core of your adrenal gland. And so those are actually modified postganglionic neurons. They actually do not have axons, so they're called anaxonic. They release epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into your bloodstream. All right, now let's look at the anatomy of the parasympathetic. This comes out of your central nervous system in different areas. So this is called the craniosacral division. So it comes out of the brain and out of the sacrum region of your spinal cord. The preganglionic is actually very, very long. And so the ganglion are usually called terminal ganglion because they're very close or actually in the target organ. The postganglionic is going to be extremely short. So let's look at some cranial nerves you already know and what that is part of the parasympathetic. So the cranial nerve that controls the pupil is actually the ocular motor nerve. The cranial nerves that control salivary glands, you have the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and actually the vagus nerve also controls some salivation. The vagus nerve is the one that goes down to the heart and to the abdominal viscera. So we'll talk about especially the vagus nerve in AMP2. So let's look at these autonomic neurons. And when we look at sympathetic and parasympathetic, they have many times contrasting effects. They have opposite effects. So there's two reasons for this. So number one is that your sympathetic and parasympathetic, your postganglionic neuron, secrete different neurotransmitters. So sympathetic postganglionic secretes norepinephrine, and the parasympathetic secretes the acetylcholine. The second reason is that you will have different receptors. And so some target cells respond to the same neurotransmitter differently because of the type of receptor that you have. What we have is for receptors for acetylcholine, we actually have two different classes of those, and we have two different classes of receptors for norepinephrine. So acetylcholine is going to be secreted by all preganglionic neurons in both of the divisions, both sympathetic and parasympathetic, and by the postganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic. Any axon that secretes acetylcholine are called cholinergic fibers. Any receptor that binds to acetylcholine is called a cholinergic receptor. Norepinephrine is secreted by nearly all sympathetic postganglionic neurons. They're called adrenergic fibers. Receptors for norepinephrine are called adrenergic receptors. We see that a lot of your organs will have both parasympathetic and sympathetic fibers going to them. So you have two kinds of effect. One is antagonistic. That means they oppose each other. They have opposite effects. The other effect is cooperative. So you are working together to get an overall effect. So usually what we see is that these two divisions don't innervate an organ equally. Parasympathetic has more of an influence on your digestive organs, whereas sympathetic has a bigger effect on your heart. So an example of cooperative effects would be with the salivary glands. Parasympathetic produces a more watery secretion, so they're stimulating the serous cells. Sympathetic increases more mucus, which is why your mouth feels very almost dry. It has a very thick mucus feel to it when you're stressed. Now, we do have some control without both of them working on an organ. So, especially with sympathetic fibers, only sympathetic. So when we look at the adrenal medulla, the inner part of your adrenal glands, it's only sympathetic. The erector pili muscles, only sympathetic. Your sweat glands, only sympathetic. A lot of your blood vessels is only sympathetic. Okay, so we see this when we're regulating our blood pressure and when we're regulating blood flow. So when we look at blood vessels, let's look at that just by itself. The sympathetic will keep your blood vessels in a partial state of contraction. So a little bit of vasoconstriction. And so we call that vasomotor tone. If you increase firing of the sympathetic, you're going to cause more vasoconstriction. When you decrease the firing of the sympathetic, you're going to cause vasodilation. And so this is where the sympathetic can actually control vasoconstriction, vasodilation. So there's two reasons why we would do this, and you're going to get into the details in A&P2. One is, this is one way we control blood pressure. And the other way is how we control blood flow from one organ to another. When you constrict, so you look on here, this is vasoconstriction, and so you can cut off a little bit of the blood to a certain organ, such as to your skin. And then with vasodilation, where you open it up, you can open up and bring in more blood, such as to your skeletal muscles and to your heart. All right, so the last little bit is looking at the control of the autonomic function, okay? And we're going to just describe how the central nervous system can influence autonomic function. So the cerebral cortex can influence, especially your emotions. So fear and anger, anxiety, that's part of your limbic system. And so that can change autonomic function on this. Your hypothalamus is your major visceral motor center here. And so it also has some primitive functions. It has your hunger center, your thirst center, very, very life functioning nuclei in this area. What else is your midbrain, pons, and medulla? And so your brain stem here, controlling your cardiac and vasomotor, salivation, swallowing, sweating, the bladder control. And then also your spinal cord reflexes can be integrated in your spinal cord. So these are autonomic reflexes. So if your spinal cord is damaged, then you still can have some control of your bowel and your bladder by just autonomic reflexes that are built into the spinal cord. So this is all that we're going to talk about with the autonomic nervous system. So go back, review back over this, and use your study guide to guide you on what you need to focus on this particular chapter.